Hi, I'm really happy to have you all here for Illuminaries, the Illuminations program's new faculty book club, book talks, book series, in which we are featuring faculty authors whose writings are really having an impact on arts and culture. And I'm very happy today, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while, to have Frank Wilderson, author of Afropessimism, here with us tonight. This book has been reviewed in the New Yorker. Frank has been giving talks all around the country and indeed all around the world through Zoom. This is actually his 58th book talk, and he is going to be interviewed today by Jocelyn Burrell. Jocelyn is a PhD student in the Culture and Theory program here at UCI, and she has spent 15 years in the world of independent and social justice publishing. So we're going to welcome Jocelyn and Frank, and I'm going to be listening in the background. And we will also take questions from you in the audience. And so you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post questions. And in the last 15 minutes or so, we'll be drawing on those questions to hear your response to some of the ideas and insights that are going to be shared today and get Frank's ideas in response to you. So thank you so much, Frank and Jocelyn, for being part of Illuminaries.
Hi, Frank.
It's been a while, huh?
Yes, it has. So we have a prepared set of questions because otherwise the two of us would be a runaway train.
All right.
Okay. So let's dive into the book head first. I'm sure others would be or share my interest in what motivated you to write Afropessimism and the writing process behind it.
Okay, and today, like when we talk one-on-one, you want honest answers, right?
Please, only.
Not from my PR firm. All right.
You're in safe hands.
All right. Well, to be honest, the motivation came from outside, in the sense that I was actually, I'd written my memoir, and I should just tell the audience, Incognito would not be here, my first book, if it were not for you. You not only published that book, but you put me on the road. And, that book was so controversial, or as my mother's sister said, so damn raw, that and the interracial dynamics were such that I had spent the advance, did not own it because I would not change the politics. And you came along with South End Press, and you paid someone who I will not mention because I know we don't call names here, but you paid off the advance that I spent. And you gave me a $1,500 advance, and you put $4,000 into a roadshow for me. So I my hat's off to you. I mean, I might not. There's some people in the world where if they were gone, the whole house of cards would fall, and I think you're one of them. So thank you.
Wow.
Thank
you.
Yeah, and so and also you gave me some very tough love lessons about how to talk on radio is not the way that you talk in a graduate seminar. So
not typically.
But honestly, I'll try to cut to the chase about your question. Basically, as you know, in 2008, I did Incognito after I got back from South Africa. Then I wrote my theory book for Duke Press. And what I really wanted to do was return to this novel that's been roiling around called When the World Was October. And I thought, you're in your 60s now, you can just do this. But Verso Press called from France, and the New Press called from New York, and they said, we want a book of political essays from you. And it was really an opportunity to get into the trade market. Not that I didn't love you and your press, because you rescued me from the trade market. Didn't want my book the way I wanted. They wanted my writing style, but they didn't want my politics. And you came Southern press, and so I really wanted a New York press. And what happened was that I spent a year in Germany, in a city called Bremen, on sabbatical, and in that year I wrote on the Black Liberation Army, and in terms of theoretical articles. And I also used the time, since I wasn't teaching, to get back into my fiction and vignettes and memoir writing. And so when the New Press asked for a book of essays, I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll do creative writing. My model for this book was Assata Shakur's autobiography, because that book has always been kind of my structure. I mean, I've been teaching that book since it was published, sometimes at the Loft in Minneapolis in creative writing, reading for writers courses, sometimes in South Africa, other places. But because it's a Black book written by a Black anti-American revolutionary, it's not the kind of book that you can say, here's what I'm doing, here's how you can understand Afropessimism to a trade publisher, right? So, but fortunately, when Verso and the New Press called for a book of essays, I'm blanking on the name, Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts had been out. And so everyone understood, auto theory. And I was able to then blend what I wanted to do creatively with critical theory, not because it had really been done in 1987 by Assata Shakur, but because the white world knew about it, because Maggie Nelson did it, and that was a selling point, and the rest is history.
That's one way to put it. And Afropessimism is not your standard academic monograph. It's a profound blend, as we've been speaking about, of theory and lived experience. And the book startles your reader by opening on a scene of mental collapse and great pain, compounded by the hydraulics of anti-Blackness. Late in the book, you write, quote, "In the 19 years since my breakdown, I have not been able to pinpoint the cause," close quote. From your recounting, though, it appears that both the psychic breakdown you suffered in grad school and the theoretical breakthrough that precipitated it, Afropessimism, stalked you from childhood. Reminiscent of Proust's Madeleine's, it seems to happen in an instant. Quote, "I was washing my face when a stanza of poetry came to me." Can you elaborate more on the origins of Afropessimism in your life and work, and the relationship between breaking down and breaking through?
Yes, thank you, Rhea. And kind of do what you do when we're talking one-on-one. When I get like this tangential, kind of bring me in, because I can, the aged mind has a way of meandering. When I was in South Africa working both underground and above ground, the kinds of questions you asked politically were, if you do this mass demonstration, or if you do this covert action like the bombing of Sasso, or as I wrote in the first book, when the comrades that I worked under in the underground bombed the Conservative Party headquarters in an attempt to assassinate Gay Darby Lewis, who had worked with the West and the Conservative Party in South Africa to assassinate Chris Hani, who was a leader of the underground. One of the things that happens before anything goes on, and people don't understand this about left-wing radical revolutionary movements, they think about the spectacle, right? The spectacle of armed struggle, or the spectacle of in the streets, mass mobilization. And what doesn't get talked about is the deep sense of intellectual rigor and political reading that goes on behind the scenes before any of these actions take place. So one of the interesting things for me was coming from a university brat, my formative years in 1968 as 12 to 1970 at 14. We had left Minneapolis, Minnesota. I lived in college campuses all over the country with my mother, who's working on her PhD, and my dad. And I was beginning to see this moment when the left was asking themselves questions about how their actions would tear down the system. Now that stopped after COINTELPRO crushed the left, right? Then the left began asking themselves questions, how do we make America better? And so one of the things that was refreshing about South Africa was the way in which any action that was taken was motivated by how will this heighten the contradictions? How will this exacerbate the antagonisms between, say, the rich and the poor, and then move us towards a revolution that will take over destroy the system first, right? And so I got back to the States and went back to Berkeley from 70, having been there for half a year as a 14-year-old, being trained by the Panthers and SDS. Then I returned to Berkeley in 1997, and I found that the radical white left had, long ago wanted to change the world, and now they had changed their minds and were into better cuisine. So these were not the questions that had been taught to me by the Panthers and the white left in Berkeley in 1970, and I became very frustrated. And so Jared Sexton is really the linchpin in this. He's, as many people know, he's a professor here, and he was in grad school with me. And Sora Hahn, and a Black woman at Northwestern, Kiana Ross. She was a professor, and she was a student at the time. And we were involved in these struggles in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. And every time we would have our meetings beforehand, I was getting really agitated because it seemed to be that the organizational left was really all about improving a country that had no right to exist. And I kept saying to Jared, where is the antagonism in this thought, And I was a Marxist. I trained people in the underground, in the cell the guerrilla cell that I worked with, in Negre, Gramsci, and Marx, and as well as I was also on the Workers' Library in South Africa. And so I was thinking the essential antagonism was between the haves and the have-nots. And Jared kept saying to me, just these little things about you need to read psychoanalysis and meld it with political struggle. You need to think about why is it that Black people have such a hard time in every arena, being heard with their demands. And then he said, maybe the antagonism is between Blacks and the world. At that very same time, we were reading through people like Saidiya Hartman and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Slavery and Social Death. And that set off a light bulb to me. So what I'm trying to say is that Slavery and Social Death redefined slavery by going back through the archive, redefined slavery in the way that Karl Marx had done it to capital, as a relational dynamic, which is an energy and a way of thinking that is anathema to Anglo-American teaching, because Anglo-American teaching is so empirical, so based on evidence and facts, and that we can't often think about the things that we can't see, the relational dynamic itself. And so this re-articulation of slavery and definition of as a relationship, as opposed to a set of experiences and a historical record, was really, really something. That book, Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, and David Marriott's book on psychoanalysis, those politicos I talked to you about in a moment ago, who were undergrads and grads, we began to see that these books were saying something about Black suffering that the white left didn't want to hear. And they were saying it symptomatically. We didn't create this. I also believe that the first African enslaved by the first, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the Arabs from 625 AD began vamping on East Africa. I believe that the first Africans understood that the destruction of Black sociality, the destruction of Black bodies, is not a form of discrimination. It's actually necessary for other people to form community. And this is what we didn't discover this, but we drew upon all the things that were said that could not be heard, and we put it together. And all we thought we were doing at that time was very simple: critiquing the assumptive logic of white feminism that I was learning from Judith Butler and Kaja Silverman, critiquing it to say that it doesn't really explain the grammar of suffering for Black women, and it doesn't explain how faux, F-A-U-X, patriarchy is inside of the Black slave community. And we're critiquing Marxism, which doesn't explain the truth of Black suffering. That's all we thought was going to happen. And then what happened? Boom. Trayvon Martin. Boom. Michael Brown. Boom. Sandra Bland. And the most dangerous thing in American politics happened is that there was a connection was drawn between the intellectual labor of Black academics and Black people in the streets raising havoc. And it took off like wildfire.
So what would you say, I'll put it in your words, the major interventions of Afropessimism are in the wake of this kind of saturation of police violence that we're seeing?
I think that the major intervention is that Afropessimism teaches us how we cannot think, not what we can think, but how we cannot think. And that sounds paradoxical, but let me go to the end so that I don't get lost in the weeds. In other words, the same bullet might kill a Black person in East LA that kills a Latinx person, but it is not the same structure of violence. And in the early part of Slavery and Social Death, Orlando Patterson makes an intervention. He says, you cannot have a stratified society, whether it's the Oedipal nuclear family, whether it's capitalism, whether it's post-colonial, the colonial realm, the colony. You just cannot have a stratified society without an ocean of violence. It takes an ocean of violence to change the dynamic of positions, not identities, positions. So first you have serfs and lords, and then over a period of 100 years, you move into this new thing called capitalist and worker. You got to have an ocean of violence to change the dynamic, and we know about that. Then he says, once the paradigm of subjection has been set up, once this ocean of violence has set up a stable paradigm where people are waking up in the morning calling themselves workers, people waking up in the morning calling themselves women and men, which are artificial constructions, people waking up in the morning calling themselves natives. Once that's been set up, then the violence that was needed to create the structure must go in under the table and turn into hegemony. In other words, you need people to agree to the structure. And then he makes this other point. He says, but that doesn't work with slavery. Slavery never, the current history, the concurrent history of slavery is the past as well. And that's a very profound statement, because what it means is that anti-Black violence is not a form of discrimination. It's a necessary set of rituals which produce not surplus value, not the usurpation of land. Anti-Black violence produces psychic health for the rest of the world. This is his whole point about why the word freedom cannot be conceptualized outside of the concept of slavery. You have to have slaves in the mine, in chains, working as civil servants. There has to be, the concept of slavery has to exist for there to be a coherent society. And one of the aspects of slavery is called open vulnerability from Hortense Spillers, or gratuitous violence, meaning repetitive violence against the slave so that the whole non-slave community can understand, oh, I may be poor, I may be out of a job, I may be despised, but you know what? I am alive because I am not Black. That's a necessary component to creating community, anti-Blackness. And I think this is the theoretical gift that Afropessimism has given, and it wouldn't be it's not that I say it's true, it's that it has spoken to so many Black people around the world saying, this is it. This is what I experience. This is the nature of my subjugation. Now, what it doesn't do is say, how do you deal with that? That's for people in the streets to deal with.
That actually leads us to my next question. Afropessimism has had a complicated career over the past 20 years. And I think it's fair to characterize that career as controversial. As Jared Sexton writes in Afropessimism, The Last Word, quote, most telling, though, is the leitmotif of offense and the felt need among critics to defend themselves, their work, their principles, and their politics against the perceived threat. In place of thoughtful commentary, we have distancing and disavowal, close quote. Perhaps one starting point is Incognegro and your first review in the publishing industry standard Carcass Reviews, which went something like, frequently beautiful, angry, and paranoid. We loved it. It's certainly an establishment opinion. But as you chronicle in the book, Afropessimism has also stirred dust-ups within the putatively radical and counter-hegemonic left. Let's consider the concept ruse of analogy. In chapter 2, you write, quote, we refused the ruse of analogy and let our rage speak the truth. Human life is dependent on Black death for its existence and coherence. What do you mean by this? And what are some of the implications for both critical theory and radical politics?
Well, I remember you and I think it was so generous and compassionate of you when you called me with that quote about from Carcass Review, frequently beautiful, angry, and paranoid, and you said, "How do you feel about this? Are you like, will you be okay with this?" I said, "Hell yeah!" You know what I'm saying? Because it's true, I am angry and paranoid. I mean, and you know what I would say in Carcass Review? Just because you're not paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. Okay?
Exactly.
I think Jared Sexton is right. There's about the way in which the radical left has called Afropessimism divisive, has called it lacking in an answer to Vladimir Lenin's question, what is to be done? And I think all that is, part of, I'm all for the kind of social projects of everyone on the left in terms of fighting against homophobia, women's rights, fighting against the scourge of immigration. But I also want to point out that all of those things are inherently conservative in the sense that they're asking the question, how can we as various kinds of marginalized people expand the terrain of civil society to include us? And what the Black gaze does, what the gaze of the slave does, which not even the gaze of the Native person can do, is it says, ultimately, you haven't actually answered the first question, which is, what right does civil society have to exist? And that's a chilling question, even for radicals on the left. There's also problematic, in getting back to the aspect of your question about critical theory, it exposes a problem inside of the most explanatory and unflinching critical theory. And the problem goes like this. One of the tenets that I accept of say, the radical feminism I learned from Kaja Silverman, psychoanalytically oriented feminism, which I call non-Black women's feminism. But I don't throw psychoanalysis out. But one of the tenets is that if you are going to move towards a kind of transgender filio situation, then you have to understand that the word woman and the word man have no organic stability. You cannot, the basic semiotic principle is that a word cannot mean a thing. A word points to another concept. So how does a word get value? How does a word get meaning? Ultimately, a word gets value by its opposition. through its conceptual opposition. And we don't have time to go into all the semiotics, but that's a very interesting point, which I actually subscribe to. I do believe that language doesn't point to the world. Language points to other conceptions of the world. Then the point is that this is the intervention of Afropessimism. How is it that you, critical theorists and revolutionaries on the left, can use the word human as though that word actually has a relationship to the real? The word human cannot be conceptually understood without its opposite if all other words are like that, which is to say that what then, we're going back to Patterson, what then is the opposite of being? The opposite is a sentient person who has the status of non-being. And that has to exist in every society that is stratified. And the interesting point is that Blackness fills that space all over the world. Now, that means that we cannot analogize Black suffering with the suffering of other people who are categorized as degraded forms of human, because they're still human. Is it translating what I'm trying to say here? Yeah. And so no one has come up with an answer to that. No, everyone says, that makes me feel bad. Well, you know what? Read the first chapter of my book, goddammit. It made me feel so bad that I ended up in the psych ward at the Tang Center at UC Berkeley. Yeah. And by the time you get to the end of the book, I hope you feel worse. But buy it at full price first. Did I answer your question?
Well, you did. And it leads us to another controversial claim of Afropessimism, which follows Saidiya Hartman's Afterlife of Slavery. You've said that nothing fundamental has changed since the antebellum era. And specifically that, quote, the master has been dispersed across the entire racial spectrum of people who are not Black, close quote. Harkening back to the Rusum analogy. Can you elaborate on the implications of this premise, particularly on the common sense notion of solidarity?
I don't think solidarity is impossible, but you have to understand who's in the room. And it's not a Black problem, it's a problem of other people. In other words, I think I'm speaking too directly to you, so I'm going to try and speak to the audience because I'm speaking our normal shorthand here. Yeah. Look, if someone is poor, right, and let's take it out of Blackness and just bring it to Marx, right, and someone is poor, they have no money, or they work in a factory, and they marry someone who is rich and say owns the factory. And there's a prenuptial agreement that says, the rich person says to the poor person in the prenuptial agreement, you'll never get any of my money. And I don't care, we're married, this can't happen. No thinking Marxist would say that the poor person has left the paradigmatic position of working class through the marriage and gone into the rich, right? They would say a capitalist married a proletariat, and they are still structurally antagonists inside of the paradigm of capital. And no one's stomach would get bent out of shape. This was the problem with my first book, dealing with myself and my current wife now, who's white. The people who owned the book before you bought it from them could not hear that a slave marries his master and remains a slave, even theoretically, because that was so. I hope I'm getting to the question that you're asking. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to say, it goes back to Jared Sexton. The emotional intensity with which the question of Blacks amongst others weighs in on is so hyperbolic that it prevents people from thinking, even radical revolutionary people. I'm not interested in talking to reformist people. I only talk to revolutionaries. It prevents even revolutionaries from thinking in a revolutionary way. And so it's almost as though you have to say something fundamental changes between intra-Black and non-Black relations when they're friends, when they're lovers, when they are in political scenarios, as opposed to accepting the structural dynamic that when a Black person enters the room, the word we no longer exists. Just like when a proletariat enters the boardroom, the word we no longer exists. It doesn't mean that at other levels of abstraction, genuine things can't happen. But that refusal to think that through is the thing that Black people have to deal with, because we are always being structurally adjusted to account for or to attend to the emotional dissolving of people who don't want to think that what their unconscious really thinks, that Blacks are still slaves and we are still part of the master class. And that's a very, very, I understand for reformists who can't do that, but I don't understand revolutionaries and critical theorists who can't do that. And so we have had a lot of pushback because A, this theory is gaining ground in Black revolutionary spaces, and B, the non-Black left actually doesn't have a theoretical answer to this thing that I just said. How does, so I'll stop there.
Okay. I actually have a question that I would like you to field, if that's okay. Could you say more about what the implications are for taking the lid off of the unconscious? And also say something about the centrality of psychoanalysis to Afropessimism?
Yeah. So the thing is that psychoanalysis is a tool that we go through and hijack. In other words, I was trained, as I said before, by psychoanalytic feminists at UC Berkeley, but there's an assumption there that cannot be levied for Black people. So why is psychoanalysis important? I should say that first. It's important because if you're interested in deconstructing, destroying institutions, as opposed to just participating in the status quo, then you have to understand what an institution is. And an institution is not just the logical assertions of President Biden or the Federal Reserve or corporate America. An institution is also tenacious fixation, disavowal, fantasy. And you can test the waters when you say to two young people are coming home from college, and one says, I go to a community college, the other one says, I go to Stanford. Well, there's a psychic exchange there, and the balance of forces is loaded with the one who's gone to Stanford. So in other words, the who we are is not just who we say we are. There's a force inside of us which is working for and against what we actually say. And so the unconscious is really, really important. That's number one. But the second point is that desire is also, I'll say for the sake of shorthand, structured by outside forces. So it's very, very difficult to say that I can desire my own Blackness inside of a world as an ego ideal. An ego ideal meaning something that if I am cured through psychoanalysis, I will find my ego ideal in people like me. That's a very difficult thing to do if all the work that the language and the symbols that go into the conscious mind and the unconscious mind are saying that being is on the side over here and non-being is over here where Blackness is. That's a really, really difficult thing to say, that I'm going to just get over what Fanon calls the imposition of anti-Blackness. So when Freud says in his first book with Breuer, I think it's Notes on Hysteria, written in 1899, that the goal of psychoanalysis is to restore the adolescent, the person lying on the couch, to common unhappiness. It's not going to make you, it's not therapy where you find your inner child and you blossom. Psychoanalysis is a surgical move, right? But it does help. And it helps to restore you to common unhappiness, where you can deconstruct your ego, give the other person their otherness, and live in a uncorrupted way with the other. Well, here's the deal. The commons is structured by what it is against. And the commons, or civil society, or the country, the commons is against Blackness. Blackness is the foil against which the commons knows itself. So when you say psychoanalysis restores someone to common unhappiness, which is to say the ability to be with other people, not to be nirvana, right? You have to understand that the commons is also not a place of psychic healing for Black people. So we actually use psychoanalysis to interrogate the universality of its claims, but to also say that it's doing something very important to talk to us about how the unconscious works and how the unconscious forms community. How am I doing? Am I getting to your question, Jocelyn?
I believe you're getting to the question. It wasn't mine.
Oh, okay.
It was from the audience.
Oh, I see. Okay.
What would Afropessimism's perspective be on the historicity of history? Does a meta theory also posit the possibilities of a second-order transformation?
I don't know what that means. What do you think that means, a second-order transformation?
This is from the audience.
Oh, okay, yeah. Let me not. So historians tend not to like Afropessimism as a bunch, precisely because history for us is not there in the past to be reclaimed. History is actually not in the archive. History is actually a function of the anxiety and the questions that are being asked today. And so you don't go to the archives to get history the way you go to the river to get water, okay? You go to the archives with an agenda, whether you understand it or not, based upon the questions that you have now. And so we're not really as interested essentially in the facticity of history, although Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection is a historical book, but it is, as she said in an interview that I did with her when I was in grad school, she wants us to understand it as an allegory of the present. When she does the case studies of Black women and who are slaves trying to go to the court to adjudicate rape, the interesting part about that is not that we've come so far, because now Black women, can be subjects of jurisprudence, but that we've traveled nowhere at all because the psychic undercurrents of the court cannot see, process, and accept that a Black person can be injured. That's what's interesting. And so I'm having a hard time answering the question because I'm not exactly sure where it's coming from. I would agree that history is important, but what I think Afropessimism does is what Marx does for an analysis of capital, what people like Kaja Silverman do for an analysis of patriarchy. It does not tell us about the totality of Black experience. It tells us something very singular about the truth of Black suffering. How everyone lives that suffering throughout the diaspora could be very different, but the truth of it is constant.
We have another question from the floor. Can Afropessimism fit under the umbrella of third or fourth wave feminism and intersectionality? If so, what is its role in those movements? For example, can Afropessimism be applied to third or fourth wave feminism as a lens to analyze ethnic literature?
Not at all. That was no. I mean, the first thing that the listener, viewer should understand is that social death does not travel. There are not multiple slaves in a society. You know, if we accept the first premise that let me stop there with three ellipses and go back to I don't know why someone would want to do that. I'm not even alive to that as a project. I mean, there are two rhetorical foundations to third wave feminism and various forms of ethnic literature analysis, and those rhetorical foundations are description of the problem and prescription of the cure. So that if you would take, Silverman's first three books, one must destroy Oedipus to destroy the nuclear family, to destroy the false categories of men and women, and move to a third term, which would be transgender, right? But her whole premise is that you reorganize kinship structure underneath a new form of narrative, not under Oedipus, which produces patriarchy, but a new form of polymorphously perverse, meaning a sexuality that is not heteronormative. And then you have a new family. And I think that's beautiful and that's great. That doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for us because in the first chapter of Assata Shakur's memoir, when the cops have her chained to the bed after her shootout with the cops on the Jersey Turnpike, and they're beating her physically, and she says, "I want a lawyer and I want to see my mother." And they call her a derogatory word and they say, "Oh, so you have a mother?" See, that is the kernel of truth in the political, in the libidinal economy, the collective unconscious, that positions Blackness. What I'm trying to say, Jocelyn, is that Black people are not political actors, we are not economic agents, and we are not family members. I'm not saying that we don't think we are. What I'm saying is that the world needs economy, family, and the third thing I said, in contradistinction to Blackness, we have always been the implements of everyone else's renewal. And that is not a thing that changes. So you cannot take a theory called Afropessimism, which explains the singularity of anti-Black violence and Black suffering, and then apply it to other groups, like immigrants, right? Because here's the deal. In 1789, there were 379,000 Black people in the South. 379,000. 30 years later, there were 4 million. How? Because we had a love fest and we all got together and got married and went off. No, we were bred like horses and cattle under pain of death. That is a different way of coming into the world, being bred, than coming through boats. And I think that I'm really, really angry, hesitant, and critical of people who try to take, before they learn what Afropessimism is, because it's a highly theoretical set of archive of texts, and apply it to their own situation when they forget that anti-Black violence doesn't look like anything else.
That seems to be a hard pill for many to swallow. Why do you think that is?
Can you repeat what you said, Jocelyn?
I said that seems like a hard pill for many to swallow. Why do you think that is?
Well, in various parts of the world, it gets easier. I'm not going to cathedralize the Germans' wisdom, but the year I spent in Germany, look, okay, I'll answer your question directly. In 1869, Matthew Arnold wrote a book, Culture and Anarchy, in which he said, we've got to change the public education system so that we capture the imagination of the poor into an education that allows them to be trained for the society of an industrial world, and that they don't start thinking about problems on their own. Otherwise, France and the Jacobin Revolution will come over here, right? And so what has happened is that anyone, I've taught at universities in South Africa, I've lectured in Canada, I've lectured in England, I've spent months in the Caribbean, I've taught most of my life in the United States. In the Anglo-American world, it is so hard to get students to understand that there are some problems for which there are no conceptual solutions, and yet these problems were not ordained by God. If you turn into a revolutionary and get into the streets, you can undo this, and I cannot tell you what it's going to be like on the other side. No. The typical Anglo-American student and the typical Anglo-American teacher and professor, and this is how narrative works also, right? Says, where is redemption? Where is the denouement? Where is the resolution? And what that means is that we as Black people don't go crazy. We are crazy, and we end up living a crazy life because no one can hear that our relation to the world does not produce a conceptual resolution. They force us into a structural adjustment so that we talk to them about our suffering as though we were them. And, you know, I just said no more days like that. I'll be 65 in a few weeks, and I'm not accommodating anyone else's agenda, accommodating anyone else's anxiety. Tough shit.
Another question from the floor. If there needs to be an opposite in order for being/humans to exist, what would or should it be if not slavery/anti-Blackness? What would be considered a non-being in our society then?
I don't have an answer for that. I mean, you know, one of the reasons why Orlando Patterson's tome, in which he, Slavery and Social Death, in which he went through the entire archive of slavery and said, bad scholars, slapping them on the wrist, because what you have done is you have not defined slavery as a relation. You have given me a set of narratives about experience. And I think that I believe there is another side to anti-Blackness. I believe the kind of violence that is needed to bring that about mirrors the kind of violence that instantiated it. We're not going to negotiate our way out of this. I also believe that the epistemological umbrella, which is to say anything that can be thought, cannot think what is on the other side. There will be another side, but on the other side, just like radical feminism, on the other side, there will not be the man or the woman, but they can say what it might look like. I cannot say what it would look like on the other side of anti-Blackness, because anti-Blackness organizes the anxiety of the world. I was a staunch Maoist in the 1970s, you know, and I can't tell you how crushed I was when, you know, I carried Mao's Little Red Book everywhere I went, right? You know, and when a bunch of college students in Beijing, you know, just lynched 3 African students in the dining room because they were trying to hit on Chinese women, that just blew me away. I mean, that destroyed my whole thing. What I'm trying to say is that everyone knows that someone is against them, right? If you're Asian, if you're Latinx, white Latinx, if you're non-Black woman, you know someone's against you. But you also know that you're not Black, that Blackness stabilizes everyone's presence. So on the other side, I believe that where we are is not ordained by God, But on the other side, there will not be the category of the human, and there will not be the category of the Black. There will be something else. And if Orlando Patterson is right, there will probably be another dual opposition that structures civil society. I think that the unconscious needs projection and aggressivity towards someone to know that it's present. I would say my last little point is that there are societies like hunter-gatherer societies, I doubt, outside of the nuclear holocaust, we'll go back to that, which use mass and fire and rituals as grounding wires to ritually and symbolically destroy something in effigy, right? Am I making sense there?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that a civilized society can ever do that. I think there has to be a real living being as the being that gets shot up by the police, as the being that gets lynched, as the being that is produced over and over again in cinema, as the receptacle of violence. I think that's what it means to live in the modern world.
If you have time just for a few more questions. As you've said today, analogies comparing Blacks to other groups suffering are not applicable. Or as you've written, quote, you can't make an analogy between the violence immigrants, Native Americans, and workers are subjected to and the violence that attends Black people, close quote. But does Afropessimism claim this uniqueness at all times in all places? Are there times and places when the differences are nearly erased and when this closer relation can be used to establish political alliances at particular times and places?
Well, I think that's a two-part question, and it needs to be separated. Look, I've been doing radical political work since I was 12 years old, okay? Mainly for people who are not Black. So yeah, alliances can happen, okay? But the erasure, the dynamic in which Blackness is that against which everyone else defines themselves, even if they don't know it. People say, oh, I don't see color. I treat everyone the same. We're all workers, we're all women, we're all pressed men, BS. Let me into your dreams, as Frantz Fanon says in The Negro and Psychopathology. Which is not to say, Jocelyn, that they're lying. What I'm trying to say is that people speak dually every time they speak. They speak from their conscious mind, and they also speak from their unconscious mind, and they're not aware of the second part. Let me put it like this. Everywhere in the world, Black people experience suffering differently. I'll grant the viewer that. But the structure of anti-Blackness is the same. So I'll give an anecdote. I believe that if most people in South Central LA woke up in Havana tomorrow, I spent 6 weeks there, and I love Cuba, I love Fidel Castro, I love the way he crushed UNITA and helped the Angolan movement, because that demoralized my white students in South Africa when I was there and helped our revolution. Okay, I love him. Okay, and I love the fact that anti-Blackness is illegal in Cuba and on the laws as being illegal. I love that also. But after 6 weeks there, you come to understand that has just pushed it underground, repressed it, that Cuba, where everybody has a ration card, access to the arts, great education, is still structurally in its libidinal economy, in its collective unconscious, anti-Black. That's number one. Number two, Black people are anti-Black also in our collective unconscious. As Jared Sexton wrote in Amalgamation Scenes, anyone who is, the discourse of biracialism is a discourse grounded on anti-Blackness. And what he does, he runs through all these texts of people who do not say, I'm Black, but they say, one parent is white and one parent is Black, so I'm biracial. And what he finds is a symptom of anti-Blackness organizing their presence. How does it go? Statistically speaking, no one says, I'm not just white, I'm Black too. They say, I'm not just Black, okay? And that is very informative. That is very informative, okay? We're up against
our last question from the floor, or are we running out of time?
I don't know.
No, take another question.
Okay.
Try to be quick.
Julia. Okay. In psychoanalysis, one talks about analysis terminable and interminable. Are there two such poles within the paradigmatic longue durée of Afropessimism?
It's too complicated a question. If I didn't have so many auditors in my class, since we're dealing with that, I'd invite them there tomorrow, but the regular students are getting tired of having all these auditors there. Let me just say that I'm going to take terminable as a thing meaning when does analysis end? But I think the caller means something more than that. And when my book is bookended by a psychotic episode in the first chapter, and I return to it in the second chapter, in the last chapter, in the epilogue. This is not to, and I'd say that I went through psychoanalysis. I mean, I did about 8 years of analysis in Berkeley, which really helped me move through the day. But it did not put me into a community of full speech, like Lacan says, with contemporaries, because I do not exist in the community except as a foil. And so I think psychoanalysis helps Black people understand. I don't think that there's a thing called sanity for Black people. I think sanity belongs to everyone else, and it's the violence against our bodies which helps them become sane. If you don't understand what I'm saying here, read the chapter called The Narcissistic Slave, where I deal with psychoanalysis, in my critical theory book, where I explain it in great detail. Red, white, and black.
Wow. Well, you've given us a lot to think about and a lot for our audience to think about. And I'm certainly looking forward to reading more of the book with our conversation in mind and just continuing to follow the development of your thought and of Jocelyn's work as well. We've had a great audience tonight, a really interesting conversation, feels always timely. There's so much has gone on this year. I would love to hear more, about issues around the pandemic and the inequities with vaccination and vaccination resistance and how that is manifesting in Black communities. I'd love to hear about the differential responses to the insurrection versus Black Lives Matter, and the way in which, police violence was deployed in one setting and not in the other. And there's just so much that I think Afropessimism provides another important framework for understanding why these issues and inequities and fears and violences are not going away, that there's something baked in that seems to be very, very hard to work through, to use the Freudian expression.
Yes.
So you've given me a lot to think about, and I think everybody here a lot to think about as well. So we'd like to thank you for joining us, for letting us be your 58th book talk about Afropessimism. And just keep going, It's very exciting.
I'm going to say Jocelyn, thank you again, because if you did not publish that book, my first book in 2008, none of this would have happened. I guarantee you. Thank you.
I'm just glad it made us friends and not enemies.
Great. Well, please check out the Illuminations website. We have events going on pretty much every day. We'll have more book talks in the spring. We're also going to be featuring a brand new play about masking as it impacts the Korean American community. Lots of cool stuff, lots of conversation. So great to see everybody here tonight.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.